Welcome to my session. My name is Emily Zion. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I will be talking about student engagement in the sex ed classroom. Before I start, I wanted to give a brief introduction to who I am. I'm originally from Oregon in the United States. I am in my 6th year teaching internationally, currently in Singapore, where I am the secondary relationships and sexual education teacher. Prior to teaching, I worked in reproductive and sexual health care. I was working as an assistant to the licensed medical staff in a health center where we were delivering services. Some of my role was educating patients on proper contraceptive use after they were prescribed a method, doing HIV tests, pregnancy tests and options counseling, things like that. So what I bring with me into my role as a sex education teacher is practice having what could be considered to be uncomfortable conversations, but also experience working with teens and adults, seeing firsthand the challenges and even the knowledge gaps that present themselves in regard to sexuality and sexual health care. So today I want to share some of the strategies and the tools that I use in my practice to engage students in relationships and sexual education program. So I want to share some of what I do, what I've researched, what I've designed, what I've been implementing directly into my teaching. I'll also share some resources at the end that have been really integral to the work that I've been doing. I want to recognize before I start as well that what I do with my student population might not be exactly what is going to be best within your context. However, these are just strategies and ideas of ways to drive student engagement. I also want to give space to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people in the audience might be really thinking about the new normal, so to speak, that COVID-19 has presented to teachers and educators, and really thinking about virtual and distance learning being that new normal in the near future. So much of what I'm speaking on is framed for being inside a physical classroom. However, I hope that some of this speaks to you as you move forward with your own teaching. So we're going to start by looking at the curriculum. So engaging student learning by making the content really engaging. I use in my own teaching the National Health Education Standards and the National Sex Education Standards. So it's a skill-based approach. So skill-based, giving students opportunities to learn and practice the skills that are going to be necessary for navigating and negotiating decisions that they're making about their own health and their own well-being. So I want students to have a variety of skills when it comes to taking care of their own health, understanding characteristics of healthy relationships, and having a variety of tools to communicate within relationships. I also want them to understand the decision-making process that goes into safer sex strategies, including communicating about those strategies as well. So a lot of the skill-based model is making the learning really student-centered. It does take some practice as far as relinquishing some control to the students and putting the learning more in their hands, which I think can be a really big obstacle in a sex ed classroom because we can be really concerned with their responses or their reactions or their behavior in this content. But we want to have that skill practice, and that skill practice is done best when we're doing it in a really student-centered way. It's no surprise that students are going to learn better when they feel like the learning is relevant, relatable, and up to date. So a huge part of this, and you'll notice on every single one of these, it says something about asking for student input and feedback. We want to make real life scenarios relevant to students. We want it to be in situational context or language, or just relatable to their experience, their social groups, and their experience as teenagers. I'll never forget, a few years back, I went through some relationship scenarios and I updated any social media references that there were. No longer was it Facebook and Instagram, but now in my scenarios, it was talking about people in relationships talking over Snapchat, right? Students actually commented. They're like, whoa, Ms. Zion, so up to date, right? Super small revision, but all of a sudden the students could see themselves in that scenario in a different way. And we're more engaged with talking about what should happen in that scenario. So keeping it up to date, keeping it really relevant is a great way to first engage the students. Also, no surprise is that students are going to learn better when they feel comfortable and when they feel safe. So designing and upholding classroom expectations in the learning environment, especially with sex ed, is going to help make students feel more comfortable. In my first few years of teaching sex ed, I spent a whole bunch of time in the first lesson asking students to brainstorm. What sorts of classroom rules would they want to have within our learning environment? And what happened was I ended up with slightly different iterations of roughly the exact same ideas, just maybe worded differently. So I'd have like one different list for every single class group. In general, students were agreeing on the same things. They wanted a respectful place to learn. They wanted people to to listen to one another. They wanted people to act mature, which I always think is the funniest one. They want people to like, come on, let's be mature about it. And usually there was a comment about like, we want to be able to laugh, right? Which is a natural urge to giggle when we see some of this content. So there's universal buy-in with these ideas. So I started finding that spending that time for the students to brainstorm and have that like ownership over the class rules wasn't actually increasing their engagement and subsequently decreasing disruptive student behavior. So how else could I make these classroom expectations and use that time? So it's important to note when we're talking about setting the classroom environment for sex ed that there's going to be a super wide range of responses to the learning content. And you almost can't anticipate every single response. In my time teaching sex ed, I've sort of figured with my student population, there's like two types of disruptive student. And I'm talking like beyond the general, they're middle school, high school students. There's some anticipated behaviors that they're gonna demonstrate. But most of the times in sex ed classroom, there's two main camps of disruptive student. And the first is the student that walks into class on the first day and says, I already know everything there is to know about sex. I don't need this class, right? And they're making jokes, or they're trying to get their peers' attention, some sort of validation, just being heard and seen, maybe saying things that try to shock people in class. So that's the first camp. The second camp is the student who is likely they've never learned this content before. They've never heard a teacher say penis. They've never seen these drawings of body parts. They're coming from a background where they've never had the opportunity to discuss any of these topics with a trusted adult. And their behavior is going to present like they're struggling to participate, or maybe not even wanting, like refusing to participate. They're distracted, or they're distracting their peers. They're outwardly expressing how gross they think it is. They're just being disruptive. So it's important to note both of those camps are students that are likely demonstrating symptoms of feeling uncomfortable or being worried or self-conscious or embarrassed, right? But they can be disruptive to the lesson. They can be disruptive to creating that safe, comfortable classroom environment that you want for all your students. So again, we can anticipate some, we can't anticipate all of our student reactions. So what can we do with our clear classroom norms and expectations in order to make the most positive, most safe, most comfortable classroom community? So I'm going to tell you how I introduce these ground rules to my students in the first class, right? We walk into class, it says relationships and sexual education across the board, and I describe it to my students with a spectrum, right? It's not binary, there's a spectrum of responses that we're gonna get, right? You don't need to tell me what student, who you are on the spectrum, but it's likely that when we walked into the class, on one end of the spectrum, there are students that read those words on the board and said, what are we learning? Whoa, nope, My stomach just dropped. My palms are sweaty. I'm nervous. This isn't okay. What are we doing? I can't believe I have to be here. This is crazy. So uncomfortable, right? And if you're on that end of the spectrum, that's okay. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got students, they usually, especially younger grade levels, don't want anyone to know who they are. But they walked in and they saw those words across the board and they were like, yes, sex ed, yes, so excited to learn, right? That's okay. If you're on that side of the spectrum, awesome, you're excited to learn, that's great. Wherever you are on that spectrum is okay. For older students, high school students, that same spectrum conversation is going to be one end of the spectrum. We have people that are already in relationships who are already having sexual activity, right? On the other end, we've got people who don't think this information applies to them. They don't think they're going to use this information anytime soon. They know they're not going to be sexually active for a really long time till they're married, maybe not ever. Wherever you are on that spectrum is fine. So we're normalizing our variety of emotions and our variety of responses that we have to knowing that we're going to learn about sex ed. Here are my 3 ground rules. All students are expected to and capable of doing these 3 things in class: of being respectful, of being responsible, and of being open to learning new things. They're on the board. We revisit them at the start of every class, but because they're so broad and so simple that I can talk about them slightly differently depending on the content of that specific lesson. So in general, being respectful is being respectful to yourself, to others, to the classroom. It's essential for open and honest, engaging classroom community, right? But on the day that we learn about gender identity and sexual orientation, be respectful at the start of class is me saying that we're going to learn about people's different experiences and different identities. And you might not understand, but you don't need to understand someone else in order to show empathy towards them and to be kind with your words to them and to respect them. So that also might be where you share with students that being respectful is allowing someone their privacy. So we're not going to be sharing people's personal stories or using people's names when we talk about people that are outside this classroom. Their information is theirs. You need to be respectful of their privacy. So being responsible looks like participating, doing your best to be on task. And I say doing your best to be on task because those kids down here that were super nervous, super embarrassed, and super uncomfortable sometimes might need a break, right? Sit this one out, take a deep breath, just sit, right? Give them that chance. And they're not breaking the class rule at that point. They're learning to self-manage their emotions. Be responsible as your laptop or device. Ground rule, right? One-to-one school that I'm at, in class we're using laptops when you're asked to use them for a task for no other reason other than that. So be responsible. And last but not least, probably my favorite ground rule is being open to learning new things. So I don't need to learn about this. I know everything there is about sex. You got to be open to learning new things. I'm really nervous. I'm embarrassed. I don't know if I can do this. We're going to do our best to embrace that awkward and be open to learning new things. Even if we don't think this applies to us right now, we might need this information in the future, right? So this is, again, the ground rule that it's okay to laugh. We're embracing that awkward. We laugh when we see something that makes us feel uncomfortable. It's often a natural response. But I'm not going to let my laughter make everyone around myself really uncomfortable. If I laugh, I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to realize that that was me responding to something that might make me feel embarrassed or uncomfortable. So these ground rules then allow us to have a conversation when students do break them or push the boundaries, I should say. We can model a conversation with a student about boundaries. Hey, you know what? You just did something. I feel like that crosses the classroom boundaries. Your behavior was really disrespectful. Let's see if we can change your behavior to be more in line with what our class ground rules are. So we're helping them self-manage and self-regulate, listen to their emotions, recognize that those emotions are often telling us something about how we feel or what we would want to make a decision about something while creating that really safe classroom community. Last thing I want to say about the classroom There is, again, as always, with every subject content, the importance of building relationships with our students. So this to me looks like wanting to help students feel empowered. They have a right to receive this information and decide how to apply it to their own lives. That's our why. We got medically accurate information. We got skills practice. All of it is meant for you to know this information and you to decide how you want to use it for your own life, in your own relationships, for your own well-being. So an example, grade 6 puberty. Before we start any learning, we look at how learning about this makes us feel. Giving them an emoji, giving them a chance to talk about their feelings, giving them a chance to check in and learn, hopefully be learning or practicing that self-regulation, self-management. In older grades, this might look like asking them to reflect on what certain things mean to them, what do they think people should do or ask or talk about, or letting them personalize the content, letting them personalize what they would want in their own lives, and think about what sorts of decisions that they would want to make themselves. So how do we do this? I talked about it being skill-based. We want it to be a chance for students to have real, authentic opportunity to practice the skills, to work with and to learn from their peers in response to real life scenarios around relationships and sexuality. We do this by making it really student-centered, releasing some of the control, which can be challenging at first, and putting more of the learning in the hands of the students. Clear expectations, clear learning objectives are going to be really important when we're making it more student-centered, as well as a variety of different individual, partner, small group activities. I found that the smaller scale you make something, the more you're increasing the comfort level for students and oftentimes making it more purposeful. So instead of we're all going to be looking at the same pictures, the same video, the same content at the same time with the whole class, we're going to do it in small groups instead, so students can digest that information on a smaller scale, hopefully increasing the comfort. Behind all of these skills, probably, in my opinion, one of the more important when it comes to sex ed is the opportunity for students to practice that communication. So it starts off with them having conversations with their peers, being able to have conversations about refusal skills or talking about boundaries, talking about permission in relationships. And it leads to their ability to talk about those things, all things in relationships that they have, moving on to talking about it with medical care providers, and hopefully even on to advocating for health and for access to health care and things like that within their own communities. So we're building that skill. I want to talk to you about a few of the ways that strategies and whatnot that I use in my classroom in order to make the learning really student-centered. So one of my favorites, gallery walks, which sometimes to me sounds a little too dated, chat stations or whatever you want to call it, but essentially interactive cooperative learning stations for students to engage with the learning in preparation for bringing it back to the whole class discussion. So gallery walk, I have a picture here. This is my classroom. I've got Velcro boards, the blue boards that I leave blank except for when I'm posting up stations. It helps me be able to put stuff up and take stuff down for each lesson. Really cool activity from Slow Chat Health, Dimensions of Wellness activity is pictured here. But gallery walk, chat stations, any sort of posted up on the wall or set on the table station where students can work in small groups, 2 to 4 students ideally, and they travel around interacting with whether it's a question or a prompt or a scenario, and doing it cooperatively in their group. I've had students do this with discussion questions where they're writing their answers down so that when we come back to the whole group, they can share what they've already done. I've done students do this with consent scenarios. They would walk around the room, read all the scenarios, and tell me if they thought it was consent, coercion, incapacitated. And the part about bringing this back to the whole group then is that I can kind of gauge who I want to share certain questions or scenarios. So I can go around and think like, this group has the best answer to this question. I want to have that group be the one that shares about that scenario. Or this group is less likely to raise their hand. If I was asking people to raise their hand, I'm going to tell them, hey, you know what? I think your response to this scenario is really awesome. In about 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to come back as a whole class. Get ready. I want you to share with the whole class. So it makes that when it does come back to whole discussion, it makes it a lot more purposeful and a little bit more guided as well. Peer teaching, really awesome way for them to not only exchange information with one another, but have really authentic conversations. So jigsaws, there's a lot of research about jigsaws and their social emotional benefit to students. I use Jigsaw for when we're doing research on STIs. So each group is going to get, in this case, the way I have it designed, they get a category or a type of STI. So first round is A is bacterial, B is virus, C is parasite, D is HIV, right? Each person is individually researching that STI. They're going to then go for the second step and check their work with other people who've been researching the same category, same type of STI. Do they have the same information? Fact check. Let's look at the validity of the resources that they used, sort of peer assess, make sure that the information is accurate and correct. And then they go and peer teach it to their original group. So by the time you get to this third step, you've got kids sitting around the room and they're like, chlamydia is a bacterial STI, it's passed through sexual intercourse, here are the most common symptoms, here's how it's tested, and they're talking about the subject matter in a really factual way with very little shame, and they're talking about it, which is the goal when it comes to the skills that they have for this content. Another way I really like putting the learning in the student's hand and making it really student-centered is blended learning. So essentially a combination of online and offline learning stations. So the way that I do it in my classroom, I have my one-to-one school, so I do have that technology access. We've got 1 or 2 digital stations online. They're doing some sort of again, working in groups, 2 to 4 people. They're doing some sort of video or digital activity that allows them to receive content, build knowledge, but also interact with their peers, their group members. The next one would be an offline station. So they're doing something that is on paper, they're doing a puzzle, they're doing some vocabulary, they're doing, this might be where you see those gallery walk chat stations that I talked about earlier, where they're going around and answering questions or looking at scenarios. And then the last one is teacher-led. So I'm there to either model or practice the skill that they're working on, still in a group, so they're still collaborating. Maybe this is where I'm doing additional assessment or giving them feedback on the work that they've completed, checking in questions, etc. A good example of this, I use this when we're talking about assertive communication and communicating our boundaries. So they watch something about it, a short video, they do a little quizzes, review of the content, they go around to these gallery walk stations and they come up with responses to scenarios that are showing communicating assertively, or communicating about boundaries. And then they come to me and I listen to their responses and I have an additional scenario that I give them, and they enact it, they role play it right there in front of me. So it's a great way to differentiate. It's a great way to engage the learners. It's a great way for them to be, again, learning from their peers, talking to their peers, engaging with their peers. Other discussion strategies, again, taking away it being a whole class discussion at the beginning, maybe giving them a chance to work in conversations, which is like a rotating small group discussion strategy. Graffiti wall where they're writing their responses instead of verbalizing them, so giving them a little bit more time to process. It's great for challenging topics. I start a sexual assault unit with them responding to questions. How do you feel about learning about sexual assault? why do you think it's important? What do you think is going to be challenging about talking about sexual assault in the classroom? And they can write out their responses. Another great strategy for if kids are hesitant to raise their hand and speak up in class, they get to write it down. And think, pair, share before any whole class discussion, turning and talking to someone next to you about whatever the question or prompt is, gives every kid a chance to talk, gives a little bit more wait time. And again, they're hearing from each other almost more than they're hearing from me, their peers. And that's where a lot of their learning is going to come from. So the last thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite ways that I've come up with a way to go a little bit beyond just the role play for scenarios in the sex ed classroom. Me, myself, I hear the word role play and my skin crawls. It's something I've never liked doing. If I'm put in a situation where I have to role play, I will like purposely not do it. Like it's just one of my biggest pet peeves. So as a teacher, I was looking at all these scenarios for kids to role play, and I wanted something better. So I designed a way for students to hear from their peers, to practice constructing conversations about real life scenarios, to really allow students to hear from one another, allow students to maybe agree or disagree with what their peers are saying, maybe challenge some social norms, all around topics that have to do with decision making, safer sex strategies, and relationships. So in our game, we've got a whole bunch of different categories. We've got a whole bunch of different leveled questions. I'm also going to throw out bonus points for the kids that go above and beyond in their groups, coming up with their responses. Makes it kind of fun. They're like competing to see if their answer is better than the table next to them. But essentially, every single group gets to answer every single question. We listen to what each group has to say about each scenario, and they get to hear their peers navigate and negotiate and really unpack what's going on in these scenarios. I'm there to take away points if they're not listening to their peers. So you actually have kids holding each other accountable to their team's engagement as well. So we've got everything from couples in the scenarios navigating decision-making when it comes to being sexually active. We've got how do you bring up conversations to your healthcare provider about your sexual health? How do we talk about testing? How do we actually plan this conversation? Is it face-to-face? Is it over text? Does he text them first and then they sit down? How does this conversation take place beyond just what's being said? What happens when there is a positive STI result, right? This question can really stump kids. But then at the same time, there are some students who will come out with a response that's like, William's going to call him and tell him chlamydia is a bacterial infection. It's not really that big of a deal. Antibiotics to cure it. You should go get tested too. Here's where I got tested. Here's the doctor's number. And they come up with this like awesome response. And the whole class just heard a student coming up with that response, right? Super awesome, super empowering, normalizing these conversations as well as practicing them. What sorts of things are going to happen when there's drinking and alcohol involved? How do we expect there to be a norm, a social norm about these sorts of behaviors, and how do we challenge that? And listening to their peers navigate these sort of situations is really powerful. And what are we going to do as far as talking about being sexually active? What sorts of things are important to negotiate and discuss? How do we normalize conversations and actions that communicate consent to sexual partners? So again, all things that the students themselves unpack. They listen to each other, they make these conversations, and I get to sit back and reward them with points. It's a great, I found it to be a really great tool that's really engaging for the students. So a few resources that have been really impactful for me, for my teaching practice. Really recommend, especially if you're pretty new to sexual education, or if you've been around for a while and you want to play around with some new ideas. Great references, great resources to check out. So thank you so much for sticking around, for listening to my session. I'm available, questions, feedback, any resources that I talked about in my session, they're on my Google site. You can reach out to me there or by email or on Twitter. Thank you so much. And as I say to my students, make good choices. Thank you. Hello, welcome to my session. My name is Emily Zion. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I will be talking about